what you predominantly work in or where, or?
I teach predominantly at the School of Nursing. I'm involved with our LEND program as a faculty mentor for about the last 6 years as well. My interest is really social determinants of health, but I still see so many people who don't understand autism as a neurological condition. And so I was just interested in hearing what you guys are kind of doing.
Definitely. No, I appreciate that. And I think, may I ask where you are for the
well, the background behind me is my office building in Newark, New Jersey at Rutgers.
At Rutgers. I was going to say, I thought maybe perhaps I recognize that my family lives in Carteret and my cousin Rutgers. So
super
time. Yes.
Yeah.
So you know what, even though perhaps and there are a couple others, I'll go ahead and go through my slides. But again, like I said, Dr. Porter, I'm happy to keep this in for everyone else as informal as possible. So stop me at any time. I recognize this isn't even fully encompassing, and then I want to open it up for discussion on what you're seeing also. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so as you all know, my name is Rujitha Wilson. I am at UCLA and I'm director of the Neurology node. And, you know, one of the many reasons this is a part of our AIR-P is because, we know that co-occurring neurologic conditions are very common in autistic individuals, things such as seizures, epilepsy, insomnia. And interestingly enough, it's not that they just occur at one point in the lifespan. They can start in infancy, early childhood, all the way through adulthood, something that is hopefully becoming increasingly recognized, but many providers actually don't know and still think that these are just things that they should be screening for at a certain age point. So some of these examples are that autistic individuals are up to 30% higher risk for seizures. Sleep disturbances, on the other hand, are reported to be in up to 80% of autistic individuals. These are things like insomnia or just difficulty maintaining sleep, delayed sleep onset. And then another and prominent area of my focus is motor dysfunction, which is becoming more recognized within research and in clinical practice. I should say more so in research, but we know it's highly prevalent and pervasive across a lifespan in autistic individuals and present in a very heterogeneous manner. So I think you guys might actually still be seeing my not full slides, so give me just a moment. There we go. So when we think about these co-occurring conditions, we also want to think about the impact that it can have on autistic individuals. And that's one of the main reasons why we really want to think about how we study them, how we include them in our clinical and research practice. So we know that seizures and epilepsy can impact adaptive function, cognition, and overall development, particularly earlier seizure onset. And many of the studies that we've done is predictive of poor cognitive outcomes. Sleep disturbances can have tremendous impact on cognition, regulation. They can exacerbate other co-occurring conditions in autistic individuals and worsen overall quality of life, as well as physical health. And motor dysfunction can lead to a plethora of things, but includes increased sedentary behavior, impacting physical health, reduced opportunities to engage with your peers or the community, both the family as well as the autistic individual, and potentially can impact cognition, language, and social communication, given the fact that we know that in early life are really important or lay the foundation for these skills. So in regards to gaps, these are really recognizing just a few. There are certainly others, but my goal are a few different things, or my goals, I should say, which is really improving the recognition of these co-occurring conditions by healthcare providers. Of course, neurologists are looking for these, but even advanced practice providers, such as yourself, Dr. Porter, other subspecialists, such as developmental behavioral pediatrics, psychiatry, and then of course, our primary care providers, that these conditions are prevalent and really warrant screening even in the primary care setting and across a lifespan. And appropriate sort of maybe first-line treatment, if that's appropriate in the primary care setting, or even outside of the hands of a behavioral specialist, and referral, recognition of the side effects of that these medications can cause. And one gap in area, particularly that the Child Neurology Foundation is working on, is transition in care. Just shut off this one. Many of our autistic individuals moving from adolescence to adulthood are getting lost in care or being continued to be cared for by their pediatric provider, which is when you think about it, not really an issue other than the fact that there are likely preventative measures, conditions, screening that need to occur than an adult provider would be more familiar with than a pediatric provider. Or there are numerous pediatric hospitals that, of course, do not care for autistic adults. So these families and individuals often sort of get left in the space where they don't have any care. I also think it's really important in our research studies that we include evaluation of individuals with co-occurring neurologic conditions. Oftentimes, epilepsy or seizures are an exclusionary factor, and there's a tremendous need to better understand why epilepsy occurs, but also how it can impact other areas of life and treatment and intervention. This kind of goes along with the fact that epilepsy rates are higher in autistic individuals with intellectual disability or lower intellectual functioning. And for that reason, these studies often also do not include those with intellectual disability. That's another great need. So those are some of the gaps. Although that's sort of been encompassed, a lot of these gaps in many areas of our other nodes, I'm going to just focus in on what year one brought for the neurology node, which was really focused on this motor dysfunction, targeting motor dysfunction and making programs that do this widely accessible, adapted and accessible to autistic individuals and their families, and an opportunity to not only better study them for the program that we're launching, but really be perhaps in the future, after a lot more studying, somewhat prescriptive of these programs, given not only on the impact on motor dysfunction, but of course, even on positive sort of experiences for the individual and their family. So this first study, we launched a pilot study using the Expressive Movement Initiative. It's a dance program founded by Dr. Emily Coker, and subsequently we founded it at UCLA in 2019. Since that time, we launched a study, a weightless control study to study this program. The mission is to provide an expressive outlet for individuals with developmental disabilities, foster mentorship and a sense of community among students and volunteers working within this program, and eliminate the stigma and reduce the challenges associated with disability on the UCLA campus and beyond. This is in addition to some of the other areas that we were studying that I just mentioned. We have now to date served over 150 children in person and over 60 children virtually. I actually need to update that number with these quarter's numbers, so I need to do that on the next because that's increased. And as I noted, we launched our first pilot program studying these in just this last academic year, and we're now in the process of looking at those results and hopefully submitting them soon. So I will actually stop there just in, let's see if I can. I don't think I'm any sharing screen, just in an effort to help with or aid in any discussion, or Dr. Porter, any questions or anyone else might have, or suggestions or experiences from your practice.
Regina, I'd love to learn more about kind of what you've learned through the Expressive Movement Initiative, kind of what findings are coming up, even if they're anecdotal, because you have just started collecting pilot data and maybe you can't draw conclusive interpretations yet, but I'm interested in hearing what you've learned so far.
Yeah, that's a great question, Emily. Thanks for asking. So what I'll tell you anecdotally, and I had seen this before, given some of my other research in adaptive sports programs, but this sort of expanded and was really telling to me. Anecdotally, we've decided to just move beyond measuring the individual who's participating, but measuring sort of, they aren't really social determinants, Dr. Porter, but actually determinants of engagement sort of with the community, or barriers to inclusivity, what I would say, to autistic individuals and their families. And what we heard from a lot of families was that not only providing this program, but the fact it was virtual, particularly during a pandemic, offered a way to not only increase sort of movement in their child, but also engagement in what they felt was a really positive and healthy program where their child can interact with other children virtually and with these volunteers to sort of have that impact that, not only am I able to do this, there's something to do during the pandemic, and also from the families saying that these children were then able to better sort of engage, I shouldn't say engage, relate, for lack of better words, to their siblings who regularly participate in these programs, right? Who always have the opportunity to participate in these programs. And I think that sort of impact or quality of life or positive influence or inclusivity on the family is really striking to me, and I think important to further measure. From the individual perspective, what we're finding briefly, and we really have to run, I'll kind of get more research statistical analyses on these further, and I'll be doing that with Jeff, who's on this call, but we are starting to find some improvements in movement, areas of movement, and also areas of social reciprocity that we measured on something called the social responsiveness scale. So those are some early findings, and I look forward to kind of delving into them a little bit more.
Great, thank you.
Dr. Porter, any thoughts or even just comments on that, even if not questions?
Actually, a lot. When I heard your 3 topics, I was like, sleep, yes, motor differences, yes, and within the pediatric nurse practitioner community, primary care and what we call it acute care type of practitioners, I guess around the motor for me is, and I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know, that motor stuff shows up so early. I mean, it shows up, if not shortly after birth, like 1 or 2 months later, and moms who've been moms before will then retrospectively say, yes, I knew there was something going on because motor-wise, I could tell there were the differences. Now, my understanding is, and at least in terms of primary care, there's not like a good tool to evaluate that motor stuff in primary care. So by like a non-PT or someone who's not their specialty. And I just always wonder if we just keep waiting, and your program sounds wonderful, but it is teenagers, right? Or, school age children, that like those, and I'm going to call it habits, but I understand that it's not habits, but those kinds of things are more settled in. And if we were able to recognize it earlier, screen for it earlier, and then try to even get early intervention, even before even any thoughts of autism were there, what's out there, what's possible, what is anyone doing about that? And sorry for the long spiel.
Oh my goodness, are you kidding me, Dr. Porter? You're singing my language. I want to ask, 1, if I can place you in a future talk to make a comment like that for me, kind of seed you in the audience, or 2, can you please review my grant? Because you've highlighted so many salient points there, I think, both from a clinical perspective and a research perspective, which is, I'll kind of parse that out going back, that 1, the fact that you are seen and hear parents say, just anecdotally in the clinic, there is a difference between this child and my other child. The fact that it happens so early is so important, because we actually just recently published a paper on early concerns. And one of the first concerns of parents, because that hasn't really been looked at, caregivers were saying, we're motor and temperament. Like, my child was just different. These are infant siblings, so infants who have a sibling with autism, hence their elevated likelihood we're now using rather than the high risk, which has been in the terminology. But you're completely right in the fact that it starts early. The second I'll kind of go through later is there are not great screening tools, actually. But one of the reasons is because these motor manifestations are quite heterogeneous, right? Particularly in later childhood. And a lot of our motor measures are sort of binary. Do they walk? Do they not walk? And they're not really made for those with intellectual disability, which can further increase your motor impairment. So there's not a good clinical screening tool. And lastly, you're right. If we look at this earlier than adolescence or childhood, we have an opportunity to be almost predictive of later symptomatology, or intervene a little bit earlier so we don't see more motor impairments later on. I'll just tell you, and I think it will, at some point I didn't get into this, we'll probably tie into the AIR-P, but my research program outside of the AIR-P is exactly studying early infant motor development and how early infant motor development in infants at elevated risk and using wearable sensor technology. So objective measurement of these movements to be able to understand not just predictive, but exactly what you're saying is once they're settled in, or once they're compounded by other co-occurring conditions or medications, what really is that early trajectory and how does it lay the foundation for later? With the ultimate goal to be able to come to someone like you, Dr. Porter, and say, hey, actually at age 2 or 1, these are the things that you should be looking at, or these are the things you should be thinking about in later childhood. The other thing I'll just comment on, this program, actually the expressive movement, is 4 years through 17 years of age. So across the lifespan. I actually purposely, because of the pandemic, despite some of the research limitations, chose to keep such a large age range just because so many families were losing services. And I figured on the back, sometimes you have to balance research with also need, right? The accessibility for these families. And so we'll of course account for all of those things. In the future, we'll probably have a more narrow range, but I really want to be thinking about really early childhood through that older. We would go even younger, but a lot of that has to do with sort of ability to stay engaged virtually. But when we're back in person, my hope is we can have a younger cohort as well. So that's all to say, beautiful points. And just hearing you say that makes me feel very positive, the fact that we're making this a focus of the AIR-P. So I'm really glad to hear you say that. You know, I think another thing that you mentioned was the sleep. And I think that's really another important thing that we should be looking at. And I'd like to see moving forward, crossing over with our other notes, lifestyle and things of that nature, because not only do we need to understand the etiology, we need to improve sort of how families are able to implement realistically changes we're asking for better sleep. And I think if we can do that and show those improvements to the family or help them with that, that could be more telling even for further actual tools for practitioners to use also.
Yeah, I think the main thing that I'm seeing is people not screening at least yearly around sleep. And then if someone is screening, someone, whether it's the specialist or the primary care provider, who takes ownership of that sleep. And not that there can't be input from both, and there should be input from both, but so that it doesn't get missed.
Exactly.
From year to year or half year to half year.
Yeah. And I think what has been, years ago at INSAR, about 4 years ago, I'll say, I attended and was struck by a group saying, we tried to implement behavioral sort of things, but then we actually went into homes to see if that was happening. And we found that one, it's difficult, but two, there are a lot of factors that families don't think are impacting. And there are, like, a young individual who had 100 stuffed animals on his bed, and stuffed animals are really stimulating to him. Family thought that could be really comforting. So, and then given just your practice, I have a feeling you probably already know, but Beth Malo, MALOW, has more recently come out with some, I believe, screening tools and video tools that have been helpful. So in case you haven't seen it more recently, I had been looking at that recently and I found that helpful as well, in case that's helpful to you. Any other comments from anyone else? I think otherwise we need to wrap up perhaps, or it's going to take us out of the breakout room maybe.
I did have a really quick question. So I know you are still in like the data collection stage for the dance study. Do you have any kind of preliminary information to share, or do you have anything? Yeah, I guess any interesting results that you've noticed so far?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Madeline, perhaps because you're doing about 1,000 things. Emily had asked that.
Oh gosh.
So yeah, so I wonder.
Sorry.
No, not a problem. Well, you're also managing about 100 things and helping all of us out. So I appreciate that. Oh, I think it's gonna. But I had just gone over that. We saw some help, some things that families noted were really helpful, and then some improvements in motor and social reciprocity. But when I officially come back in a week, Jeff and I, who's already been pouring through the data, will be pouring through it a little bit more.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Porter. I really appreciate you attending, and I really appreciate your time and comments. Please feel free to email me at any time with any thoughts, suggestions, or just clinical experiences. I would love to connect about that.
Sounds good. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.